Why Suez exists is simple arithmetic: distance, fuel, time. Asia to Europe via the canal cuts roughly 3,500 to 5,000 nautical miles compared to the Cape of Good Hope, depending on the ports. A ship burning 100 tons a day saves a week and a small fortune in bunkers. Multiply that by container loops, product tankers, LNG schedules. Days off the water become seasons put back on shelves, refinery blends kept on spec, harvests delivered before rot. But Suez isn't one canal. It's two, braided by capacity and discipline. There's the engineered geometry, depth, width, cross-sections tightened by rock and widened by dredge. And there's the choreography, northbound and southbound convoys, pilots boarding on moving ladders, tugs that make mistakes survivable, VTS officers reading traffic like air traffic controllers with ships that can't stop on a dime. The 2015 expansion added parallel stretches and passing bays, but the southern reach still funnels steel into single file. Throughput lives on margins, swell, wind set, hull size, pilot fatigue, the bank effect tugging a giant towards sand. Hidden fragilities sit on those banks: sand berms that slump after storms, slope angles that flirt with liquefaction under prop wash, dredging cycles that juggle silt budgets with budgets on paper, tug fleets needing parts sourced from faraway yards, a pilot corps whose experience is a resource you can't accelerate with a memo. One loose bolt in that chain, a broken fender, a misread gust, a tired helmsman, and a routine transit becomes an incident report. By the 21st century, dependence was baked in. Ultra-large container vessels threaded their lives through Suez, turning ports like Rotterdam, Algeciras, Piraeus, and Port Said into synced gears. Crude from the Gulf slid north, products south. The SUMED pipeline backed up crude when tankers ran too deep, but nothing replaced the canal's rhythm for diesel, jet fuel, and specialty blends that European refineries rely on. LNG rode narrow timing windows, boil-off gas, berth slots, and regas calendars that don't forgive slippage. Grain, fertilizers, and chemicals took the same path, less glamorous, more essential. Egypt built a fiscal umbilical on that flow: tolls in hard currency, jobs for pilots, tug crews, yard hands, mooring gangs, hydrographers, national pride pinned to a waterway that paid wages and foreign exchange. In good years, the canal's receipts smoothed deficits. In lean ones, they kept lights on. Policy followed the tide: expansions, dredges, and monument speeches promising capacity and sovereignty in the same breath. In apartment kitchens from Ismailia to Port Said, parents checked prices and calendars and told kids not to worry while they worried. What nobody sells on a platform is the human cadence. A pilot puts on his life jacket at dawn, steps from a heaving launch to a steel ladder, and becomes the most important person on a 400-meter ship. A tug skipper nudges a bow a meter left and saves an insurer months. A dispatcher delays a convoy 15 minutes to avoid a wind set that could tip a box wall into a bank. The miracle isn't the water, it's the restraint. Then came the modern reminder: a single hull wedged sideways and global trade learned a child's lesson: draw a line and block it, and everything behind it smears. 6 days of blockage echoed for months as the delayed wave hit ports like a squall line: too much, then nothing. That wasn't the first time Suez went silent. It was the first time social feeds watched it in real time. What keeps planners awake isn't a ship, it's the map. We built ships the size of cities, but a narrow line through sand and salt still owns the calendar. The map kept rewriting itself quietly. Ships got bigger, weather got weirder, safety margins thinned under schedules that asked steel to behave like spreadsheets. Dredgers kept pace until they didn't. Bank reinforcements bought time, process bought more, but the math stayed the math. A week saved is a week earned, so traffic funneled on. Meanwhile, the canal was a mirror of the century. Nationalization turned a private dream into a sovereign artery. War turned it into a moat. Peace turned it back into a cash register. Every upgrade, deeper cut, wider bend, new signal, tried to buy resilience against physics and people. None erased the core truth: Suez is a narrow line on a map that carries a wide slice of life. And that's why last night's silence felt different. Not because ships haven't waited here before, they have, in heat and dust and frustration, but because the system built to absorb shocks had already been working overtime. Red Sea security jitters, climate pinches in Panama, container cycles running hot. The canal was the steady drum. When it missed a beat, the song faltered. To understand forever, you don't start with catastrophe, you start with dependence that hardened into habit. Suez taught the world to live closer to the edge of time. It delivered until the day the edge shifted. How forever happens, failure modes that don't reopen. It's not a meme-worthy ship across a channel. Forever happens in slow motion by stacking failure modes that don't yield to a dredger on overtime or a minister's press line. The villain isn't a saboteur you can arrest. It's ground, water, and angles, the quiet physics that don't care about quarterly targets. Start with the ground itself. The canal rides on banks that are engineered, not eternal. Slopes live at angles chosen against physics and budget. Years of prop wash scour the toe. A heavy storm, a spring tide, an unusually long convoy cadence, little pushes, can tilt a reach toward instability. When a bank slumps into the fairway, you don't just scoop it out. You first stabilize what's still moving. That means weeks of surveys, geotextile riprap, careful dredging that doesn't undercut the next failure. Meanwhile, drafts shrink, convoys thin, and schedules unravel. If subsidence extends beneath critical bends, geometry, not will, closes the door. Then the structure behind the geometry, dredging cycles that depend on spare parts coming through global supply chains now slowed elsewhere, dry docks booked months out, and contractor finances tied to sovereign payments under stress. An under-maintained dredger breaks a gearbox. The replacement sits in a sanctioned factory or a congested port. One missing component becomes 3 postponed work windows. Sediment doesn't pause. It fills where you meant to cut. Capacity declines quietly and then obviously. War doesn't need to declare itself to close a canal. A new kind of conflict, cheap drones, precision rockets, floating mines, can make the approaches feel like alleys with unpredictable fists. You don't need every bridge damaged, every pilot station hit. You need enough risk to move insurance into a new column. Exclusion, breach riders, war risk zones widened. A single high-profile strike near Ismailia or in the Bitter Lakes spooks underwriters. P&I clubs issue guidance. Transits at owner's risk, premiums multiples higher, warranties tightened, no dark AIS, no deviations, no lingering. Owners read that as a stop sign unless freight rates explode to compensate, which most cargoes won't bear for long. Functionally open can behave like closed when risk pricing outpaces margins. The legal layer can lock harder than concrete. A collision in a narrowed, compromised reach leaves a hull aground and the liability picture smeared. Was the slope unstable due to insufficient maintenance? Was pilotage constrained by hazard notices that arrived late? Cargo owners, charterers, the Suez Canal Authority, and the ship's insurer enter a fog of claims. Courts freeze the hull as security. Salvors demand guarantees. With hull and machinery cover in dispute and war risk riders blinking, nobody moves without signatures that take months. Ships wait at anchor, others detour. A canal that might be physically passable becomes legally inert. Add environmental lock. An anomalous storm train pushes sand into a throat you've kept marginally clear for years. The Nile's high flood, juiced by a freak seasonal pattern, reworks near-shore sediment. Turbidity spikes limit safe dredging windows. Regulators, burned by a spill during a rushed recovery once, require fuller EIAs and live monitoring before you touch bottom. You should welcome the caution. You can't fast-track nature without paying twice, but the calendar doesn't forgive. Channel stability waits, while paperwork moves at the pace of trust. Sanctions and geopolitics lace through this. Spare parts for tugs sourced from a country under export controls. A dredging contractor blacklisted after a separate dispute. Financial sanctions on a state-backed yard delay a refit. Repairs slip. Contingency fleets shrink. The redundancy you count on becomes a theory. When infrastructure depends on global cooperation, a cold wind from far away can chill a hot desert ditch. Pilotage is a human bottleneck that can fail without headlines. You can surge gear, you can't surge experience. If fatigue rules are loosened under pressure and a near miss becomes an accident, the corrective swing tightens hard. Stricter windows, heavier tug requirements, narrower allowable wind. Throughput drops by rules designed to save lives. A canal that technically reopens moves half the ships, then fewer. Lines read the math and route south for stability, not speed. Now imagine a layered crisis. Kinetic risk on the Red Sea approaches, a geotechnical slump in the southern reach, insurers sharpening pencils and dredgers sidelined. The decision becomes rational, close indefinitely while you diagnose with multi-beam, ADCP arrays and bank stability modeling, work that can't be rushed. Every week invites equipment mispositioning, ports gummed with the wrong boxes, refinery slates edited by necessity, and Egypt's fiscal hole widening. What nobody knew at the start, the threshold for permanent isn't the day you say the word. It's when networks rewrite themselves around the absence. Carriers formalize Cape rotations. European refiners hardwire alternative crude and product routes. LNG portfolios delete Suez from certain windows as default. Insurers set new baselines that don't slide back. Egypt renegotiates with lenders on the assumption that toll revenue will be a shadow for seasons. Here's the what, if that, underwriters whisper. If the canal stays dark for a year, the world doesn't just reroute, it rewires. Factories shift, contracts forget. The canal can reopen to a world that no longer needs it the same way. That's the gravity well. A closure extends long enough for alternatives to gel. Even if you reclaim depth and stabilize banks months later, you face a trust deficit. Schedules aren't experiments. They return last. There's one more trap, fixes that backfire. Brute force dredging into a moving slope can trigger more slumps. Overly aggressive convoying through marginal geometry raises accident odds. A rushed pilot pipeline graduates too fast. Each bad outcome tightens legal and regulatory clamps. Forever becomes a posture, not a prophecy. Enough layers, ground, metal, money, law, weather, people, align, and a narrow line on a map stops behaving like a gate and starts behaving like a wall. The forced detour, Cape of Good Hope, becomes the highway. While notices stacked on desks in port said, Captain spun compasses south, the math wasn't poetic. Asia, Europe legs that banked on Suez suddenly wore an extra 3,500 to 5,000 nautical miles. 10 to 14 days appended like an unwanted footnote. A 22-knot schedule turned into 16 to secure fuel margins. Bunker planners recalculated stems, hundreds to over 1,000 extra tons per voyage, depending on hull and weather. Those numbers don't live in spreadsheets. They hum in engine rooms where chief engineers shave half a knot to make Fremantle on safe reserves and whisper to crews that lights in corridors go dim so compressors don't. The fleet felt the tug-of-war. A single detour doesn't just stretch time, it steals ships from everywhere else. Carriers stripped capacity from trans-Pacific backhauls to salvage Asia, Europe rotations. Blank sailings cascaded. The weekly heartbeat, the promise your container leaves on Tuesday, lost its rhythm. A textile buyer in Antwerp stared at a terminal appointment that had nothing to meet it. A reefer exporter in Mombasa finally saw space because scarcity uprooted patterns nobody planned for. Then the sea reminded everyone why the Cape isn't a line, it's a season. Off South Africa, the Agulha's current races southwest, warm water packed tight against the shelf like a moving wall. Strong westerlies run counter, where sheer spikes, waves stack. Rogue crests that look like bad stories arrive as single decisions, slow or punch and risk. Masters who'd only read about the Agulha's rings briefed crews like they were new again. Extra lashings on stacks, lids checked twice. Doors barred at night, so a wall of water doesn't rearrange a corridor. Insurance noticed. War risk shifted off the table for some, weather and deviation priced in on others. Underwriters widened warranties, continuous AIS, no dark patches, no unapproved ship-to-ship. Premiums crept upward to meet uncertainty they could defend. Owners passed that along not in speeches, but in freight rates and temporary surcharges that never feel temporary. The Cape doesn't live alone. Detouring ships need bunkers, pilots, and ports that weren't waiting with empty calendars. Durban's berths and yard space ran hot by day 3. Walvis Bay took calls outside its usual cadence, drafts at limits, cranes working overtime. Luanda smiled and winced. Traffic is revenue and stress in equal parts. Las Palmas saw mid-ocean plans convert into calls, and its bunkering grid learned new hours. Every extra hour at anchor burned auxiliary diesel that wasn't in the plan. Schedules broke in human ways. A feeder in Tema waited 2 days for a mother ship that never made the window, then 3 more for the next one to roll cargo. A trucker in Lagos slept in his cab while dispatch hunted a chassis tied up under a container that was supposed to have sailed last week. A pharmacist in Lisbon clicked through a supplier portal and saw a lead time jump from 9 days to 21. She called the rep and heard 2 words, via Cape. Reefers carried their own timer. Bananas, citrus, chilled meat, cargo with a metabolism ran on gensets designed for delays measured in hours, not days. On deck, second engineers watched temperatures and begged for clean power while bunkering slots slipped. A vessel master told his crew to ration lights in passageways. Small choices kept compressors humming. In a supermarket backroom, a worker tossed a crate of browned fruit and stared at the date. Portside, cold stores became lifeboats, pulling what they could earlier and holding longer. Somebody always paid, either in extra diesel, lost shelf life, or a discount applied to hide it. Blank sailings became euphemisms for triage. Network planners in Copenhagen and Busan drew new loops with Cape contingencies, turning what was once an exception into a menu. They cut secondary calls at smaller ports, consolidated at hubs with draft and gear, and promised recovery voyages that would arrive when pilots and cranes could breathe. Exporters whose weeks depended on that secondary call learned the cost of being second. Meanwhile, piracy maps, not the headlines of old, but the small, opportunistic thefts, shifted their shadows. Not an explosion of risk, a sharpening of attention, extra watch on the stern at night, water cannons staged, citadel drills refreshed. The code was simple: don't be the easiest target on a new lane. Inland, the Echo arrived on rails. Atlantic gateways into Europe, Valencia, Algeciras, Bilbao, La Havana, took boxes meant for the Med, and trains to Lyon, Duisburg, and Paris sold out paths. Customs desks that ran at peacetime tempo hit their limit. Green lanes for perishables expanded by necessity. A pallet of reagents that used to clear in hours now needed advocates and timestamps. People learned new names: Agolhas, Lakesos, signs. Geography turned into policy in a week. Fuel markets did their own arithmetic. A global fleet steaming longer consumes more, even at lower speeds. VLSFO prices at Atlantic bunkering hubs ticked up on tight barge schedules and forward demand. Long-range product tankers turned circles into ovals, pushing arrivals into European hubs out by days. Refiners rejigged turnarounds. A Spanish utility nudged gas bids higher for a late heat week, padding for an LNG cargo whose boil-off was now a factor. None of it screamed crisis, all of it moved money. And through it, Egypt felt the silence as a ledger. Every southbound hull that turned the corner near Cape Town erased a toll that had paid salaries and debt. The pilots who didn't climb ladders, the tug crews who maintained engines anyway. The Suez Canal Authority still published circulars, ships still filed notices. The canal sat like a lung that wanted to breathe. The Detour wasn't heroic, it was stubborn. Steel kept moving the long way, and the world relearned what time costs when geography withdraws its shortcut. For some, the Cape became a route, for others, a habit. The longer it lasted, the more that habit hardened. Oil, gas, and a hot September. Longer voyages aren't just time, they're molecules arriving late. Europe felt it first in crude and products. For years, Gulf barrels rode north through Suez into the Mediterranean's refinery grid, Mohammedia to Sarok, Cartagena to Sarok, then east to the Po Valley and Bavaria by pipe. When hulls swung around the Cape, cargoes hit calendars, not clocks. Arrivals bunched, then thinned. Planners at refineries who live on blend plans watched their slates go asymmetrical. Here's where refinery math meets weather. Late summer heat still hung over Spain, Italy, and the Balkans. Air conditioners pulled load into the evening. Jet demand hadn't stepped off the runway yet. Diesel was the quiet backbone, trucks, harvesters, ferries. Crude was available, just misaligned. A prompt med cargo delayed 5 days turned a cat cracker's feedstock schedule into a jigsaw. Yields that usually flexed got stiff. Margins moved to where molecules were scarce. Diesel cracks widened. Jet premiums followed. In a village outside Thessaloniki, a farmer ran his palm over a hot tractor hood, counted the diesel left, and chose to harvest in one punishing day instead of 2. Product tankers had their own detour bill. Middle distillates that routinely shot from the Gulf through Suez now faced the Cape penalty or a reshuffle out of the Atlantic basin. Some came from the US Gulf, but those ships were busy feeding Latin America. North Sea refiners leaned into runs where they could, but maintenance windows booked months ahead don't levitate. A scheduler in Rotterdam cut normal gasoline exports to protect diesel for neighbors staring at harvest. Choices were triage, disguised as optimization. Then LNG timing added its knife edge. Gas-fired plants in Italy and Spain were already shouldering late heat afternoons. A single Qatari cargo swinging south meant boil-off calculations on a longer leg and regaz terminals with berths planned to the hour. Miss a slot and you weren't just delayed, you were uninvited until the next window. Traders glanced at calendar spreads and paid up for flexibility clauses. Arrive Thursday or Friday, not just Thursday. Those clauses cost real money. Utilities paid anyway, because blackouts cost more. On shore, day-ahead power markets read the mood. With gas arrivals jumpy and hydro below plan in parts of Iberia after a dry summer, prices jumped in late afternoon peaks. Coal units that had been running in reserve got warm starts. A French nuclear unit returned from maintenance 2 days early because a fix finalized faster than expected. In a stifling apartment in Bari, a grandmother switched off the air conditioner and opened a window to the heat. Those little lucks matter when LNG punts a day. Strategic reserves hovered like a pause button. Ministers asked for options, coordinated crude releases to smooth refinery slates, a limited diesel release to cut a premium hurting truckers. The slide decks were ready. The hesitancy was simple. Releasing is easy, refilling at a higher price after the spike hurts. Memories of prior drawdowns kept fingers from the trigger until hospitals called, backup generators running longer, ambulances sucking more diesel in traffic made thicker by freight detours.